how to introduce ecological psychology to I don't want to say the masses because I think that's going to be challenging, but to people that are interested and want to get started somewhere because it's not something you just I'll watch a 10-minute how-to listicle video on that and get it.
If anyone creates that, I'll be remarkably impressed and very suspicious.
Yes. That's the thing that I wanted to sort of discuss. When I look at my history in being introduced to ecological psychology, ecological dynamics, and the approach as a whole, I started my first year in undergraduate university in sports coaching, but I didn't know the term ecological
Mm,
until I graduated my master's 5 years later.
mm,
So I was exposed to the approach through what's called the constraints-led approach to coaching. So I was exposed through action, through practice, through how do you apply this philosophy, this theory, the psychology in practice, and the ins and outs of constraints, affordances, holistic approaches, and how you constrain environments, because that's what the constraints approach is. That's how I was introduced to the philosophy, but I didn't know
mm.
anything about bifurcations or metastable attenuation or attractors or any of that sort of stuff until afterwards. You,
Yeah,
however,
I have just been like, oh, you're interested? What? Have everything then. It's interesting because what I was doing before, because I knew what we were doing today, so I had a little extra time this morning, a rare moment. So I was kind of reviewing our interview with Julie and Jeff,
oh
and
yes,
it was really interesting to go back through and say, oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah, yeah. And one of the things of like their like elevator pitch of ecopsych because they have practiced it a lot.
yes, they've spoken
And
to lots of people.
it was interesting how Jeff, see the way I perceived his approach was actually through action. He said it was perception, but I'm like, Julia's was pure perception, like pure, like, this is a cup. I know I can pick this cup up because of the environment we're in and because
Mm.
of the interaction with me and the like, yes, perception makes perfect sense. And then with Jeff's, it was very much we study how we perform everyday behaviors and we do it in a way that links them to any other natural phenomenon, which is like that is very action, maybe a little bit of cognition if we're using the same triangle they use, which is kind of cool and I quite like that. So I put that down to play with. And then obviously we've got how I learned was through interactions with you. So you've got the very much action approach from constraints and affordances, which also kind of makes it. I got all three going on all at the same time.
I the way I would envisage both of us going into it is I'm stepping into like the paddling pool and then walking forwards into the diver's end. You just like cannonballed in the diver's end.
Yeah, yes, 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 pretty
So,
much.
so I can't swim. I got no floats. I got no help. I'm just cannonballing in and hoping I come up at some point.
Because I also read some of the papers they were talking about, and they're like, "Oh yeah, yeah, that one, yeah, 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 help, just to kill me."
Yep.
Like, yeah,
Yeah,
and it's interesting as I'm kind of as I'm working through the my businessy side and bringing my business that isn't working for clients up, it's like, okay, cool. Well, let's lean into the coach because the business world needs actual coaches,
ooh.
not what we have currently.
I think there are coaches in the business world, but they don't use the constraints-led approach to, I don't want to say to coaching because obviously that is somewhat constrained. The term
Yeah.
coach has or should have, I should add there, should have a professional qualification to it, I would argue. So I would say to education, because I don't think the constraints-led approach to teaching, the constraints-led approach to coaching, and the constraints-led approach to educating, I think are all different things.
Mm. Well, they are because they're different environments. And
Yes, we recognize that, but when you look at the research, they combine constraints-led or CLA. I'm going to abbreviate it because I can't be bothered to say that every single time. The CLA approach, so constraints-led approach to coaching and teaching are put together, which I don't like because coaching typically is, in the literature anyway, is sport, which is motor movement, skill acquisition, which is different from teaching most of the time because that's maths, English, geography, history. That's not motor movement. So I think when we're talking about the CLA and applying it to education, we need to be specific on the context we're talking about. So
Mm.
I have a CLA approach to education, and the way I see this at the moment is, or the way I'm challenging or trying to challenge my understanding at the moment is how do I apply the CLA to a YouTube video? Because that is essentially how I'm going to try and introduce the ecological approach to other people.
Mm.
How do you apply the CLA or ecological dynamics to YouTube video education?
Mm.
I've got some ideas, but
Yeah, I think I'm kind of doing something similar. I'm still kind of trying to get the right word at the end, but it is like the CLA approach to productivity and organization because the traditional approach is so prevalent in the business space.
so I'm scripting out the video at the moment, and I was thinking inside the book, Julia and Jeff write, they talk about the traditional approach, but
Mm.
that's not technically accurate because it's not a traditional approach. It's traditional approaches that aren't ecological in all of the ways, to be
Yeah, it's a
specific.
traditional approach is. Yeah,
Because there are some approaches that are traditional in that they follow certain assumptions, but they're not as traditional as others. So there's sort of like a spectrum, as it were, of traditional approaches, some leaning more ecological than others. So I
Mm.
think I think the way I want to express traditional approach is having a "s" on the end, because there is more than one. There are
Yeah.
variations of the approaches with the assumptions that they hold.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Traditional
recognize that adds in
approach
a
is.
bit more nuance and it doesn't simplify the situation at all. It probably adds more complexity, but I think it's more accurate.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of the way that I've been kind of cognizing, because that word needs to come back, because I like that word. Feels good, that process, cognizing. The way I've been thinking
Thinking.
about it, yeah, thinking. I just wanted to use that word one more time because it feels so good to say.
Is that what we're going to do? We're going to bring it back and we're going to make everyone have another word from the
Yeah,
ecological approach
obviously.
that is different. Like we can't say information and mean the same information.
No,
Information
of
means different things.
course
Affordances,
not.
they mean different things. Your affordance is different from an ecological affordance.
Mm,
So
yeah.
instead of saying thinking, we say cognizing. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
of
not
course.
thinking, we are cognizing.
Cognizing. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, it's so annoying. But yes, carry on. Sorry.
But yes. Um,
You were cognizing.
I was cognizing. I'm just use thinking now. It's used too much. It's lost its fun.
I'm being serious here, John. Come on.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't remember.
Okay. Yeah,
I
you forgot what you were thinking about.
genuinely. It'll come back.
Okay. It's funny you mentioned that you forgot something because obviously that refers to our last episode and a potential episode in the future, which is where I want to take this conversation now a little bit. When we're talking about introducing ecological psychology, there are elements of the approach that we don't have answers for. And I think the ecological approach is put under scrutiny that is not leveled with the traditional approaches. Because when you look at memory, I mean, I have a 1,000-page textbook about cognitive psychology,
Hmm.
and it says we don't know, we're not sure, we need more research, this needs to be clarified, there are too many areas here of just we don't know, unsolvable problems. And that book is all about cognitive psychology and traditional approaches to memory, to attention, to perception, to learning, reasoning, all those sorts of words that we discuss in psychology. Yet when you look at the ecological psychology approaches and those that are talking about ecopsych, they get bombarded by questions that we can't answer because we haven't done the research, and arguably we can't do the research because then you constrain the environment so the research is less valid. Uh, but then when they look at, so the people that are questioning ecocycles, when they look at their research, they don't have the same level of scrutiny. And I'm like, one, that ain't fair. Um, it's not fair. Um,
Not fair. Why
yeah.
you don't do that?
And two, when we introduce people into this approach, if we try and discuss those very abstract differences, it's very hard to say, oh, yeah, we're right and you're wrong, because it's hard enough to change a belief when you see the fact. Some people don't see, some people see facts that go against what they believe, and they still believe what they believe. So, how we manage to introduce those sorts of people to EcoPsych, I don't think is possible yet.
No, it kind of goes with the as I'm watching because it's January, so
Yeah.
everyone is getting organized this month, just this month.
The fresh start
Um,
effect and New Year resolution and yeah.
and and then you've got people going, I work differently. Like I'm not gonna do XYZ this year. I'm not gonna like I am an individual. You are an individual. And I'm like, yes, okay.
Carry on.
So what are you doing? Because that is the bit that I get. Oh, what everybody else is doing? Ah, okay.
I so it's funny. I was watching this isn't meant to be a hit piece, by the way. I was watching Justin Sung's recent video. And Justin Sung, for those unfamiliar, is someone on YouTube that has labeled themselves a learning coach, I think, or something. They're a coach of some sort because I remember hearing the label and was not entirely sold. And they teach people about learning.
Are we referring to our definition of coaching or the
Precisely.
traditional approaches to that definition?
Precisely. I really don't know. Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, they label themselves as a learning coach and they discuss the information processing or an information processing approach on YouTube. They have videos up, just find like Justin Sung on YouTube and you'll find them. And they did a video about study with me video. And I don't know why. And the reason I want to point this out is
Because Ali did it and he got famous on
maybe. But when you look at his approach to teaching and his approach to education and learning and the theories behind it, which is what he discusses, he's one of the few people online that actually goes into depth. Not quite enough depth for my liking, but he's trying to do it to an audience that's younger than me, trying to target, I believe, high school, young university students. So he doesn't discuss Bayesian statistics, he doesn't discuss active inference or probabilities. He's looking a little bit more broad at what?
Still laughing the fact that I showed it. Showed my son made a video based in statistics, and he was like, "More, please." And I'm like, "No, I can't go with more. You're welcome to go look it up yourself."
Yes. But yeah, so Justin doesn't go into any of that, but he does discuss, oh, free recall is better than this recall. You need to retrieve, you need to encode, because obviously it's information processing. We need to encode things better, and all those sorts of things. And and a lot of the actions, the things the educators
Do
shouldn't
it
do,
better.
that's what he tries to push it. He tries to push with these things that you shouldn't do. And I'm like, okay, so you believe in cognitive load theory, and you think that learners should have an element of cognitive load, desirable difficulty in the environment that they're learning in. So you do a video where you don't give them any load at all, and they just listen and follow along. I don't understand the point. Like he's pushing all of these ideas, but then when it comes to practice, he's given instructions, but they're written instructions. Just because you've given them doesn't mean people understand them, interpret them the same way, or actually do them. But he's done this video, which is where I really don't understand the leading by example, I guess you could say.
Mm.
When I look at the educators online, They talk about something, but then
Mm.
they do something else. And when it comes to introducing this ecological approach, how do you do this online? Because I think that's the best way that we can teach, we can educate, is by showing how to do the thing. Not necessarily talking demonstration, but enacting, doing the thing itself, being constraints-led approach, taking a constraints approach to whatever it is that you're doing. And that's how I work, that's how I behave. So an example on YouTube online is when I saw something, I show the source in as many ways as possible because I want to show the affordances, give the affordances out there for people to use. So I'm not constrained. I'm choosing not to constrain the environment by adding affordances potentially. Again, terminology here is a little bit loose, considering there's no guidelines for applying constraints-led approach to videos on YouTube. But I think having those affordances available, having no, incorrect term, having the information available for the individuals to perceive the affordance, the opportunity for behavior, is what I'm doing. So I'm not reducing the constraint, but because that's typically what you would say. I'm reducing the constraint because the
Reducing.
information would be there, but I'm adding information to the environment.
Yeah.
Actually, am I adding it? I guess I'm not adding
Uh,
information to the environment because the information's already there, but I'm adding enough information for them to go and find it.
you are.
Because I'm making it easier for them to find it.
It should be affordance.
The affordance is what they are perceiving. Like people perceive affordances, they perceive through affordances,
Yeah.
and the affordances are collected information. And the information in a video technically is there. Like all the information is there. I'm saying it and potentially showing it on screen, so it's there. Can you find it though? Is the ability to go and find that easy? No, in a lot of cases, because it's been plagiarized or AI's muddled it up in some way to make it impossible to find the original source. Uh, so I'm making the information easier to find by adding in further information. Yeah, I'm not sure how I would explain that through an ecological approach yet, but that's what I'm trying to do with sources as an example. Um, how we then introduce the rest of the stuff, again, I think needs to be done through practice in some way.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
It because that's exactly what I'm kind of been working on is how to incorporate. I mean, I already do it,
mm,
like, but it is attuning to it and providing those opportunities in my work. So in the work that I do
I guess
with,
it's highlighting
yeah,
how and why the differences between CLA and traditional approaches.
yeah,
I mean, even direct learning. Like when we look at the theories around direct learning, it's because all of it's done in skill acquisition and motor learning and motor sports mainly. When you take it out of the sport physical environment skill, you can still describe it in the same way, but it looks very different.
yeah,
Me learning how to throw a ball, hit a ball, punch someone, like they are physical skills, but learning something that is more abstract and potentially embedded within written information that you would traditionally see as stored in my memory bank,
yeah,
wherever that is, how would you then explain that learning? I can explain the learning environment that happens. Like when someone learns something through a lesson, I can explain that through the ecological approach. How you then create environments in lessons, I can also explain depending on the information that you want, like the goal you want them to get to, because you have goal-directed behaviors, the same as a sports session, and you have information that you want to expose, and you want to constrain the environment to get people to lean towards certain affordances or attractors in that environment that suits them in that context. That's I don't want to say that's easy, but for me, I could explain that quite well. And if people have questions, again, I can challenge that. Online with YouTube videos, I'm lost.
yeah. I think that is the in content in general, the constraints of like creating content, videos, text, audio, podcasts, everything. There are so many additional constraints that
So I listened back to, this is part of the video essay I'm doing at the moment about misinformation. I listened to Derek Muller from Veritasium, and he said YouTube will revolutionize education because it is bringing visual and audio together. And I'm like, yes, yes, it can revolutionize education, and it has made learning far easier for lots of
Mm,
people.
mm,
But, but it has lots of limitations.
mm.
How do we get around those limitations? And that is where I think the abstract philosophical approaches of ecopsych do very well at explaining the limitations. But
Yeah.
how do you then get around those limitations through using an ecopsych lens? That is the point of this podcast episode. How do we do that? John, how do we do that? Solve my problem for me. You're the coach. Oh wait, no, you're not a coach. You don't guide. You don't guide. You need to tell me the answer and then I follow
Oh,
your
yes, of
instruction.
course. Okay, so here is my answer that is only relevant to me. Don't create it. Just do only coaching. Okay, that is how you make money. All right, yeah, you charge a lot of money, offer a lot of money, and then you get loads of money, and then because you got loads of money, like that's the
You,
only way you can do it.
you tell other people how to make loads of money whilst
Yeah,
making loads more money. Right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, no.
But
So,
if I slightly less sarcasm, but that is because if I look from my environment, like what I perceive, I cannot perceive a way of doing that. So my primary focus is one-on-one interaction with like because
rewind a
it
second. You say perceive. You say perceive. I choose to use interpret there because I believe we perceive through affordances. So when you say perceive, what sounds harsh. What do you mean when you say perceive?
I suppose it is exactly what I interpret.
Okay. Are you
Yeah.
just saying that because that's the word that I use?
No, because that's an accurate represent. I am interpreting what is going on around me. Like I am interpreting what I can see in the environment that I'm in and the situations that happen, the physical environment, all of the environments, not just the physical one.
So you're interpreting your perception of affordances.
Mm,
Right. Okay.
basically.
I just wanted to clarify that because when we talk about the ecopsych world and people use the term perceive, oh, I perceive this and I perceive that. I don't know whether it's they are perceiving an affordance or they're so when some people say I perceive people to be like this or be like that or do this thing, are they perceiving that? Or are they interpreting that from the affordances they are perceiving? That's how I would explain it. I know it
That
sounds like I'm
sounds
it
it
sounds like
does.
I'm going around the houses to get an explanation out, but I feel like it's more accurate.
Yeah, yeah, interpreting. Yeah, because perceiving is a difficult one because it's an yeah. There's so many. There's more.
Yeah, words.
Yeah, exactly. The using perception is almost like using my brain kind of thing.
Hmm.
It's a little bit abstracted, whereas this is how I interpret is a little bit more. It is much more accurate, and it's also a little bit more vulnerable
Hmm.
because this is
Yeah.
my interpretation.
Yeah, true. True. It's interesting that when I think about the words and terms used by those that aren't familiar with this, they use perception. I perceive that to be blah blah blah. Or oh, that's my brain or my mind. Like these
Mm.
philosophical terms and psychological terms that are used in everyday language in England anyway. Obviously, if you're from another country, then I don't know whether the same sorts of words would be used. I'm not sure. Obviously, there's going to be cultural differences to the words and terms used. So when I look at conversations and people say, I perceive this and I perceive that, I internally replace those words with interpret because I don't think what they are perceiving or what they say they are perceiving is actually their perceptions. I think it's their interpretations of the perceptions because other people can perceive other things. And that's where shorthand, oh, it's the same thing. You perceive differently to what I perceive, which I don't think is entirely accurate. I think they perceive the same things. I think they perceive the same affordances, but their interpretations of the perceptions that they are getting are different. So that's not where, oh, the information is different. I'm seeing something different to you. No. And that's the small differences, the sleight of
Yeah.
hand, as it were, of words that changes from a traditional approach to an ecological approach. When there's
Yeah, because
argument.
if you think about it, all of the affordances are there.
Mm,
The affordances are in the environment. They exist. It is, but how we interpret them influences our behavior. So
precisely.
yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Because
So
when
is it interpretation of their perception or interpretation of their affordances of what they perceive, interpretation of their perception of affordances?
Well, yeah, because we perceive through affordances. So you
Yeah,
could shortcut it and say the interpretation of affordances, but
yeah,
it's not all of the affordances because there are lots of them. It's like saying my interpretation of the information in the environment. Like that's just so broad that could mean
yeah.
anything. So to be more specific, my interpretation of the affordances in the environment, okay, that's a little bit more specific. And then to narrow in on the point that you're,
Interpretation of my perception of my affordances in the environment is
yeah.
more accurate, just very wordy.
Yeah. So you're interpreting perception. And
Yeah.
by saying interpreting perception, assuming ecological psychology and we perceive through affordances, you can say affordances information and then specifying non-specifying information with direct information that goes into all of that perception-y stuff. Um, so when I hear conversations of people saying, "Oh, we're seeing different things," or "You don't see the same thing I do." No, they are seeing the same thing you do. They are interpreting it differently.
Mm.
And that slight change of explanation for me helps clarify the context of a conversation. So
Yeah.
when I see online conversations, whether it's a podcast or a video podcast or a conversation in a video or interactions back and forth, it's the interpretation of the perceptions that are different. So when people are arguing, a lot of the time, it's someone has an interpretation of information that's been exposed in whatever way, and they interpret it differently because of the perception, because of their perception of the information, of the affordances.
And if you want to go in a slightly different direction, if you think about like um Facebook and how our feeds are completely customized
Mm,
to what we interact with.
mm,
So what one person sees and what another person, the information that's in the environment through Facebook, if that is one of the environments. It's interesting just looking at my feed versus my other half's feed
mm.
because they are very different. And then you're like, oh, that makes sense on this, that makes sense on that. And then going back to our conversation last week with my friend, with my perception of what videos that my daughter was watching.
Interpretation.
Interpretation, yes, thank you. What my interpretation of what she was watching was not good or not
It was
like,
different.
yeah, but it was different. And then when you challenge, I think it was you, yeah, when you
Yeah.
challenged that, I was like, oh yeah. And then I
And that's a really good example because
and I
both of us
listened.
perceive the same affordances, but your
Yeah,
interpretation of the affordances were different to mine.
yeah, yeah. And then and I've been listening a little bit more to what's
And
happening. I'm like, oh, interesting. Because my daughter is incredibly good in social situations, like understanding other people and how they feel, which is not traditionally viewed from a neurodiverse
mm,
autistic approach. but she's very good. But that's I believe she is attuned to the affordances of the videos that she's watching. And I'm like, oh, interesting. And then recently they've started asking again to play Minecraft. And I'm like, oh, I see what you're doing. Because in Minecraft it's a constrained environment where they can explore, where she can try things out, figure out things for herself, and then take that with her. And I'm like, oh, cool, carry on. And it's really interesting, just that like a difference in interpretation.
Yeah, I love that.
And I think it's just fun and exciting because a lot of what I was doing previously in my business was all about changing the interpretation of productivity and systems and how we interact. And that is continuing now. I thought, oh, I'm going to have to throw it all out and start all over again and just do this and just do that. But no, it is continuing. It's just how I'm interpreting it is changing.
And I think to extend that as well from your social media example of information, it's not static. We're not discussing a
No,
static interpretation. It's
no.
an ongoing developmental interpretation that is consistent because there's no snapshots. We're always living. We're always consistently moving
Yes,
forwards. So when you refer to, oh, I have a different memory or a different experience, no, you've had different experiences which
you're having.
change. Well, yeah, which change throughout time, so your interpretations are ongoing. So if you were to pick a snapshot, which some people do, and say, okay, your interpretation and my interpretation are different. Right now they are, yes, likely because of the information that we have been exposed to, that we are attuned to right now in this moment. But as we move forwards, potentially you are exposed to a piece of information that you were exposed to before, but you are perceiving it differently through affordances because of a lack of constraints or an addition of constraints, which means your interpretation is now shifting and changing. So now you change your mind, your interpretation shifts, and the conversation can then lead in a different direction, which is how I navigate talking with other people. Whether you talk about motivational interviewing or other psychological tricks and hacks to navigate conversations and conflicts, which is what the OECD framework is trying to discuss as a competency, is navigating conflicts. If you take an ecological approach to a conversation and you see them as two evolving interpretations of the same information, well, now I can look at it and go, okay, what information is the other person attuning to more than me, or do they have a level of expertise somewhere that I don't have, which means our interpretations are different? Like, what is causing the interpretations to differ in some way? Obviously, there are multiple causes that are nonlinear, but are there causes you can identify that would change? Which is where script writing and researching for videos, specifically YouTube videos, I'm talking here, is really important. Because if you say one word before another word, someone could interpret it drastically differently just because the words are round the other way.
Mm.
I think a tangible example here is if you say there are 10 things, like there are 10 good things or 10 hacks, 10 tricks, whatever, tricks and stuff, and you give the trick and then you explain the trick, most people will have an interpretation of the trick as soon as you say it. But the
Mm.
stuff afterwards, they go, oh, yeah, yeah, whatever, whatever, next one, next one, next one. Whereas if you explain something, the trick thing first, then give the summary of the trick, now the interpretation is different because the order at which you perceive the information is different. So when you're scripting something online that is very linear in its delivery, you can't sort of stop and go, oh no, you didn't interpret that bit the way I intended. Maybe we'll do it this way. You can do that in a lecture. You can't do that in a video. So you need to be specific about the order at which you choose the words and things that go on screen. And the same thing, what words do you put on screen? What order do you put them on screen? What assumptions could people make with those words on screen, which is what I think makes an ecological explanation, which is just script writing.
Mm.
But then you're lacking all of the other things that come into the constraints-led approach. How would I constrain that environment for someone that is less able? Well, I can't because it's a video. It's a solid video. Once I've done it, I've done it. Which is where I think the constraint of the medium, YouTube video, doesn't afford some of the things we would like to do with the CLA when it comes to desirable difficulty. And you could say the same for the traditional approaches, because obviously desirable difficulty is still part of the traditional approaches, and you can't really add another video for it. So how would you, what are you thinking about when I'm discussing this?
The reasons why I don't do content.
That doesn't help me, John.
I know, but you asked the question. But
Yeah.
it's why I've always struggled.
Mm-hmm.
Like from a business perspective, like content is exposure. It is being in the memory of other people. That's what marketing and content's all about. I should just post lots so people remember me and then they come to me. That's the belief.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad you clarified that. I was like, being in the memory of other people. Sorry?
Basically, for me to get work, I have to talk a lot and create lots of content and post a lot because then I remain in their memory because
Right.
obviously they store it every time they see my face. And when they store my face, that sounds horrific, by the way.
Mm.
As you store my face, you remember, like you have a memory store where I'm just having fun taking a piss now.
Yeah.
When you the more times you see my face, the more likely you will to hire me. That is what the traditional view of marketing is and why I should post. It's not wrong, it's just
Doesn't feel
overly.
good.
Yeah,
Doesn't feel good. It's interesting because, like you say, it's not wrong and it's pretty accurate, but you can explain it through two different approaches. And I my immediate thought when you said that was, well, what about that one really impactful thing? Like
yeah.
they just happen to see a piece of content of yours, or maybe just an interaction with you somewhere, somehow,
Mm.
that made the difference. Like just
And
one memory
that's
making a
that
difference.
one of the things that I've been thinking around is my interaction with this podcast in terms of like where I put it. It's kind of a little bit in the ether, and I don't really think about it very much. And it's not part of the business stuff I talk about. And I'm like, why? Because as I'm shifting my attention towards the coaching element, it's like, ah, I have a lot of content, an awful, scary, alarming amount of content that I can talk about. Because,
When you've got
like,
2 years worth of a podcast.
yeah, we've got 2 years worth of a podcast just sitting there beautifully and wonderfully. And it was like, oh, okay, cool. So those can be expanded on and conversations can be had and how my view has changed. Because of course I started from a different approach. I knew that I knew that there was something wrong with the traditional approaches that just didn't
You
feel.
you had unsolvable problems.
I had unsolvable problems with the traditional view. Traditional views. With the traditional views. So I was always curious to try and figure it out.
Hmm.
Try,
Come up with some solutions.
yeah, come up with solutions. I like finding solutions and figuring stuff out. And so when we started this, and hence why I was so open to the idea of what you were saying.
I
Still,
think that's what so going back to the intro to ecopsych, I think that's what the audience is. It's the
yeah,
people that are potentially struggling with explanations of what's going on, but they've got to be open-minded. I
yeah,
think. I don't think we're going to get a closed-minded person accepting an ecological approach easily.
No, no. I think it is very much. I mean, the way that I'm thinking about my marketing is it's for people who've tried everything else and they still haven't got the answers that they needed or wanted.
Yeah, the
That's
people
kind
that
of
have
right.
struggled with traditional approaches
Yeah,
and
they have these traditional approaches. They've tried all of the tricks, the hacks, the tips, the tricks. They're not working. Or a lot of what's happening now is is doubling down on minimalism. So do less,
again,
just do less. Well, yeah, it's not really stopped, to be fair, but I'm seeing it again. It's everyone's like, someone made a post who ended up becoming a client, talking around like I have loads of things going on. I'm over committed, and I'm like, okay, okay, I see the assumption there. Now you may be years, but do you want to? Everyone went just do less, and I'm like, well, they a bit better than that, but
yeah,
that was the overarching that
the
their
rule of
assumption
thumb.
was they need to do less. So reduce what you're doing. Do this. Think about. And I'm like, okay, cool. Do you want to do less? And the answer to that question was not really. Because I feel the same way. A lot of what comes at me at the moment, it's like, oh, and I remember you had the same experience. It's like I'm doing quite a bit of D&D. I've got my business, I've got my family, I've got lots. And one of the questions that I had, because one of my players started kind of helping me craft a city in the world and the royal family in that area, and they're like, I now understand why you have so much, like how long it takes for you to do what you do. And I'm like, yeah. And they asked how many games I was running, and I run four separate campaigns. And they were like, how do you get any work done? I'm like, I don't have a choice. I don't get work done, I don't get paid. I
Yep.
don't get paid, I can't afford all the nice shiny things that I use. And so I think that's very much like everyone was like, how do you do all these things? And my reaction is, well, because I've set up the environment to help me do that. Because that is the simplest explanation. And it changes and it's not the same. I'm not always spending every hour of my day doing D&D stuff. Sometimes I'm spending more time with D&D, sometimes I'm spending more time with my work, and it is in motion, it is dynamic, it changes. And I think that for me is the interesting part for people who have tried so long with the traditional approaches to be able to approach it from almost the marketing term would be a place of chaos, because a lot of people say, oh, I just live in a chaotic environment. And I'm like, yeah, okay, so
But that's the dynamics bit of ecological dynamics.
I
Like
know, right?
that's complexity theory in a nutshell,
Yeah,
which is what I was thinking about when you were talking. Is
yeah,
it you need to have less, or is it you need to simplify? Because having less minimal and simplifying is they're different things. You can still
yeah.
have just as much, but it's more simplified rather
Mm.
than complex, because complex environments require, well, more energy to maintain stability, and entropy will ensue unless energy is put in. And if you don't have the amount of energy put in, entropy ensues. And then the complex environment explodes and you don't have control anymore, which burnout. So, yeah. So that's
So
how,
how do you um define, I suppose, simplify, like in that context?
well, the same way you would explain simplicity versus complexity. How would you explain simplicity versus complexity in complexity theory? You are the simplicity specialist after all,
I
John.
know, but I was intrigued what yours is. I know because mine is simplicity is enough. Is enough in that environment. Okay, clarifying is
Yeah.
just enough in that environment, in that context. To me, that's how I view simplicity.
But how is enough measured?
Depends on how you perceive it. It depends on your interpretation. Because sometimes, let's use a real example. Like, sometimes I have it like D&D is simple enough. In other words, I have all of the things that I need to be able to be in that environment, to be that constraint there. And then other times there are things that I'm missing that I need to, there is more complexity that I need to approach. And the same with my business and the same with my life. And obviously these I am constraining them for the explanation, but they're all also jumbled up like heck. One minute I'm doing a little bit of that, next minute someone sent me a chat about, what's going on with because I'm now in Discord, which is probably the best decision I ever made, and equally the worst decision I've ever made, because now I'm in Discord all the time because they're
Welcome
always
to my world.
so I'm just like, let's go. Ooh, let's go. Ooh. And now there is now a living environment where my players and my characters are interacting with each other. And that makes me excited because they're now building this, they're now co-creating this world with me, which is exactly what I always wanted, because they now have buy-in.
Mm. So
Which
going back
is
to
which is in essence simplicity.
Mhm. Exactly,
It's
going back to simplicity.
designing that environment.
You asked me what it was,
Yeah.
and you said enough. Obviously, simplicity and complexity is dynamic over time. So
Mm.
when I asked you how would you measure it, it's kind of a trick question because you can't
You
measure
can't.
it.
Yeah.
So,
Which
so
is why I
when,
didn't bother answering that question, because it's
but
just
that's what you
you
asked
can't.
me. You asked
Yeah.
me what is simplicity. I'm like, simplicity is a concept that can't be measured.
Mm.
Like, you can't measure simplicity because it's evolving, it's dynamic within the environments
I
that
suppose
you're
I think
in.
what I was asking was in that context, in that conversation, how
Mm.
were you using simplicity?
So how am I using simplicity to manage energy?
Yes. Yeah, I suppose yeah.
Well, I look at the energy. How do you measure energy? Well, you can't. So what's
Mm.
your best approximation for energy? Well, typically humans, organisms use feel. Do they feel energized by what it is that they're doing or not doing?
I've just got the bunny.
Yeah, the battery, what is it? Yeah,
Duracell.
that's the one. I was gonna say duplex, but I was like, no, that's a bed. Uh,
No, duplex is I think you'll find. Oh no, it's Duoplex is the bigger versions of Lego, I think. Duplex.
it might
And then
be.
duplex.
Yeah, I have
Oh
a
no, hang on. I've got Duplo and duplex.
yeah. Anyway, um, random tangent there, or was it random? Uh,
Was it random? Or were we always thinking about it?
yeah,
Was it
the
because I
butterfly
was coming
effect.
down the stair? Sorry.
It's
Carry
the
on.
butterfly effect because we started this episode. We started talking about the differences between.
And because I chose to go to the bathroom at this specific time in the morning, I saw the door ajar, and because I
Yep.
saw the door ajar, I saw my son's Lego, and because I saw my son's Lego, I am then attuned to Lego, which made me think about Duplo versus you. Perhaps as you were coming up, you saw
I
a
want to
pot.
slap you. I want to slap you. I know exactly where you're going, and I'm like, yes, John. I know. Yes, yes, John. Butterfly effect is a real thing, but it's very difficult to quantify, very difficult to explain, very difficult to justify, but it's still a thing. Yeah. So let's butterfly affect our way back into the conversation.
How do you actually butterfly effect our way?
I have no idea. I'm talking out my
Yeah,
ass. I don't know. Um, yeah, so simplicity, obviously you can't explain it, can't measure it, etc., etc. Energy can't really do the same thing because again, it's a very abstract concept. You can measure elements of energy, but again, you come back to perception. Are you perceiving objects, so measurements of objects, or are you perceiving affordances? And I think within the perception and the definition, if you want to go that far, of affordances, energy is part of that, because I believe the internal makeup of an organism is part of the perception of affordances. Because when we perceive a chair, we perceive the affordance to sit on it or not. So in some way, the organism is measuring our relationship between the organism and environment to do the thing. I am too tall to sit on that chair, or I am too small to sit on that chair. And I think the
Or I'm
metric
not
of
tired enough to sit on that chair.
maybe. And I think the metric of energy, however you want to measure it, is in some way internally perceived by the organism to look at activities. And so if a tall person sits on a clown chair, for example, they could do it, but they know there's going to be consequences when they go and do it if they've done it before. Excuse me. Whether they've done it before or whether they can see or predict, not necessarily predict as in like processing predict, but they can see that, oh, this is likely going to be this thing, i.e. you're going to be cramped because the affordance isn't accurate, like measured accurately to you. I think when we look at actions and moving forwards and doing things, acting, behaving, existing in the world, we perceive,
Organizing.
yes, cognizing, we perceive energy, we perceive organism energy. What we then do with that educates and justifies our decisions, which is where when people do loads and loads of stuff and they lead towards burnout, that is an experience, or that's a collection of experiences that people learn from.
Mm.
But if you've never experienced burnout, or you've never experienced extreme energy depletion through whether it's exercise or some sort of mental depletion through social interactions, you don't know your limits, which is where the concept of periodization comes in with managing energy. If you don't know what 100% is, if you don't know what that feels like, then you can't truly approximate what 100% feels like, which is why when I said to you about doing warm-ups and periodizing energy throughout your day, if you haven't done a max test of some kind, whether it's a 1 hour max test or a 3RM max test in a gym, or a 5 people max test. Can I interact with 5 people? How long can I interact with them before my energy, however you define it, depletes to a point where I can no longer do it? And if you don't have a max test, then you can't really perceive accurately the affordances and in those environments, in the relationship in those environments. So when you say managing simplicity, I would say it's very similar to perceiving the amount of energy you have in environments. So how do I manage simplicity? I interpret my perceptions and act accordingly from my previous experiences, which I know sounds very, oh, duh. But hopefully the explanation before that gives a bit of light into what it is that I do and how I make those decisions. Does that
Mm.
help? Or am I just
Yeah.
talking
I
rubbish?
was just really intrigued at how to explain it and how you would. One thing that I've started doing, literally
Do
just
you
this
think
week.
you could explain that then?
No. But yes. Yes. Would I collect the words? It depends. Honestly, it depends who I'm talking to.
Explain it
Because
back to me then, just as a practice run. How would you explain what I've just said back to me? Hmm. Thinking,
I
cognizing.
am cognizing. So, am I explaining it from my perspective or from yours?
Well, you can't
Or my
explain.
interpretation of your perspective?
Yeah.
Am I explaining
Well, if
what
you
I heard you said?
you
Just
yeah
to clarify.
you try and use the explanation that I've given as an explanation for whether it's simplicity or managing energy or burnout, because that's the conversation that we've had, is how do
Mm.
you apply the ecological dynamics approach to explaining energy simplicity in environments? How
Cool.
would you go about explaining that? Because that, I guess, is in a nutshell, is your job.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the interpretation of energy, I would say. Like I'm not saying all of the words, but it's almost the interpretation. Okay, actually, it's the interpretation of the perception of your energy in your environment, like in the current environment that you're in, I suppose. That would be kind of the shortest way of explaining it.
Yes. But what does that mean? Because someone's going to say, I don't get it. I understand, I have an understanding of what that means, but that
Mm,
may not mean the same thing you mean, which is where you're going to get into conflict in a conversation because your depth of understanding is going to be different to theirs.
mm.
So at the moment we're on the top of a tower. We're at the top of the diving board, but we need to cannonball in with everyone else down the bottom.
Okay, cool. Um,
We're in a thinking moment, by the way.
we
Obviously.
are in a night. Yes,
Yeah.
we're in a big thinking moment.
The cogs are
I
slowing
don't
down.
know.
You don't know. Okay.
I'm
Okay.
not sure. I think it because there are so many ways I can approach it. I think that's what I'm thinking of multiple ways of approaching it because I can approach it from energy.
How would you start? Because as we've just explored, the only real way to explore something is through action, which means explanation. And this is something that I do, which most people on this podcast will probably be familiar with. I talk before I've thought something fully out
Yeah,
because
let's
I
do that.
figure it out as I go.
Yeah, so I think I would probably start with energy and the feeling. Like simplicity is interpreting the feeling, like how you're feeling in that moment, how you're feeling with your energy levels, whether it be you are exhausted or tired, or you're motivated and excited, or whether like, and I suppose I would explain simplicity in that way, but it seems that this missing, it feels like it's missing something from that, which I can't quite
Grapple
perceive.
with. Can't grapple with. Okay. So what questions would you ask yourself then? Because obviously you're missing something, but what are you missing? Obviously, that's the immediate question. What am I
Yeah,
missing?
what am I
What's
missing?
wrong with it?
It feels very intangible.
Okay. So how do you make a feeling of energy tangible?
You can't make a feeling of energy tangible.
So what's the
No.
best proxy? How would you apply this to practice? How would you get someone else to try and measure their own energy?
Through how they feel. Through
Yeah,
how they're feeling. Ah, that's it. So maybe am I perceiving this as missing when actually I'm asking the wrong question? Yeah, I'm asking the wrong question. That is what it is. It's not because it's intangible, because simplicity is intangible, because simplicity isn't an object, a thing. It is a blur. It's a blur. Yeah,
precisely.
it's a blur. Quote.
Yes, that's how I interpret that. I don't think you can tangibly say, I am energized, I am not energized. It is a feeling that is dynamic.
Yeah.
So when people say, I need to simplify stuff, what would your response be? Someone comes to you and says, I need to cut loads of stuff out because I need to be more minimal in
Why?
my lifestyle. Yeah.
Why? My first question would always it is why.
Yeah. Because I feel, I don't know, I feel like I'm doing too much
Why?
because that's how I feel.
Okay. Do you feel like that all the time?
Let's go with yes. Hypothetical situation here.
Oh.
Yes, I feel like I'm doing loads all the time and I don't get a break.
Okay, so what can you explain? Like, what are you doing?
I don't know if I can make it up. I'm doing
So what
5
I would
different.
do, taking it out of this really horrible moment for you,
I'm like, I don't know.
I would I would look at I would gain more information because they've just given me very little.
Mm.
So the next question would be, what are you doing? Like, explain to me as best as you can, like what's happening for you in an average day, what's going on, how, and then I would ask about the feeling specifically, narrowing it down, narrowing it down, narrowing it down, constraining.
To what though? Asking questions is great. Exposing information is
Hmm.
great, but to what end? What's the goal? What's the point? Because you could end up talking for 3 hours and not get anywhere.
To what end would be to, I suppose, find a. I think I would try to understand like what their own view is of how they work,
Right.
because then that allows me to, and it also allows them to see everything and almost, uh, I would just use ecological words so that they can interpret what they're seeing
Mm.
and giving that interpretation and then exploring that interpretation with them. Like, do you feel it's too much? Why do you feel it's too much? Okay, cool. What do you want to do? Okay, so if this is the case, do you wish to do this? Like, what actions do you wish to take? What do you want to do with this? What can you do with this? What This is a few options that I see. How are you feeling about those? Like, what is this? Like, how about that? Let's try this. So for the next week, you take one. I suppose I would do what I did, would be a good example of like, okay, cool. So take one of those things and do as much of it as you can. So what I did was D&D. Obviously, maintaining everything else, but your primary focus is X. Maintain everything else, just keep up as best as you can with everything else, and do X. How does that feel after a week, after a constrained bit of time? And then go from there to help them find their max load, and then they know what their max load is in that environment, and then kind of add on and testing all of them to the point where they are like, okay, cool, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. And to do this, I need to do these things. And then goal-directed behaviors. You know where you want to go and what you want to achieve, and go from there.
And that is the explanation that I gave
Yeah.
because I spoke about periodization, and you've just given the same
Shit.
one.
Yes, so did I.
So, and that was me kind of like probing at questions. I find it interesting that even though you didn't use the same words as me, obviously we've got a different vocabulary. We've explained the same thing. We,
Yeah.
we we explained it in the same way. So when like going sort of circling back, when I asked you how would you explain that, and you sort of said I don't know after the thinking
And,
bits.
as you were saying that, I realized why.
Mm,
I couldn't explain it your way.
mm,
And that was the assumption I made. I had to explain it your way. And then when I stopped with that, I just explored it and played with it and went flying and used myself as an example. I basically explained what you did just with my words.
yes, but that's what learning is.
Mm,
Like learning is the ability to take information from the environment and reproduce it for your own goal-directed behavior.
mm.
So what you did is you learned how to do it, which is kind of why I asked you to do it. Because otherwise you're like, oh yeah, yeah, that's good, that's logical, that's great. And then you get off the call, you're like, what was he talking about? I don't know. What did he say again? I don't know. But yeah, so I guess as a follow-up question to periodizing energy, simplicity, etc., etc., when it comes to introducing people to the ecological approach, as we've explored, it can be done in lots of different ways. If there is to be an explanation or a video, because I'm obviously focusing on a video, to explore, explain, and look at all of the elements of ecological psychology, Do you think it's one video? Do you think it's a like a 2 hour video, or is it a playlist of like, I don't know, 40
I
episode
think
video
it.
playlist thing? Like,
I think it's a playlist.
so how would you split that up? Because when I'm looking at the crash course, for example, as examples, crash course psychology has a video on
I
memory.
I
Has,
don't know. I don't think that taking the crash course approach would.
but you've just said make it a playlist.
Yeah. Then a playlist of. I think it would need to be very heavily constrained. Like it would be based on a situation or something, because otherwise it's so like woo
But
floating in the air.
how do you introduce, so for if we do this, obviously we're working through this, so if we do a video to do about a situation,
Mm.
and I say constraint, how do I justify the use of my meaning behind constraint with someone that doesn't know what the ecological approach is? Because I'm using a constraint because we perceive affordances. But why
Mm.
do we perceive affordances? Because I have different assumptions. What are the original assumptions? Why do I not have a central executive, etc., etc.?
So in other words, there needs to almost be a primer to get you
To use
started,
traditional approaches, because the ecological approach
or
uses
a
a glossary of,
taxonomy.
exactly, it uses a glossary of terms that have specific meanings.
Mm.
So yes, I agree with you that there should be some case study examples of how to apply the ecological approach to practice. But before we apply the ecological approach to practice, how do I explain the words I'm going to use to apply something in practice if the people that I'm talking to don't understand those terms? If I say affordance, they're going to perceive something different.
Perhaps it is through mini mini case studies as an explanation of those words.
But even so, how do you, so taking the 8 traditional assumptions and the 9-ish ecological assumptions, how would you use a case study? This is me genuinely asking. How would you use a case study to explore potentially one of those assumptions? Because they all tie in together.
Yeah, I'm just getting up one of the assumptions.
We use
I'm
a
not
copy of the
sure.
world.
Say
Because
again?
some of the assumptions are obvious. Like we take realism over solipsism or solipsism, however you want to pronounce it, because like the world exists, and if the world doesn't exist, then studying it's pointless. Uh, that assumption easy. Both like everyone in science takes it. Um, so some of the assumptions are pretty simple to explain, and I think many people would adopt. However, when we say, I don't know, take a different assumption, maybe we have a copy of the world. How do you explain the copy of a world through a case study? I can explain it through my lens, through my experience, but the copy of the world, if we carry on with a case study example, has to tie in with the central executive, which means I've gone from an assumption to explaining what the central executive means to different people in cognitive science and how there are issues or problems with the idea about the central executive, which means I'm now
Which is
talking
an entire
abstract
bloody
again.
video in itself.
Exactly. I'm now talking abstract again, not case study. So it's like I'll do the case study. When you take the book Introduction to Ecological Psychology, they have a case study. Fred picking an apple off a tree, but they
Yeah.
spend 300 pages explaining that case study.
Mm.
See my problem?
Yeah.
Because I want to do playlists like Crash Course. I wanted to, say past tense, and then I realized I can't because the ecological approach is so intertwined with its explanations and its terminology that if I was to split those videos up, because the words aren't used in everyday language, I would have to refer back to the same sorts of videos each time. I'd have to go, this is assumption 1, video 1. This is assumption 2, video 2. This is assumption 3, video 3. Oh, wait, I've run out of cards at video 5. Like, so how which is why I'm leaning towards doing a video essay about the ecological approach, doing a somewhat comparison with traditional approaches.
I think that is,
That's what I'm leaning towards.
yeah,
Is it going to be nice? Hell no. But I
no,
don't think introducing a radical approach to psychology is going to be a 10-minute video, which is what we started this with.
yeah, yeah.
But if we do have a video essay, like that's what I would like. What I am envisaging for this go-to source. This, but right here is a textbook of Introduction to Ecological Psychology. It's a great resource for those typically in higher education and that have access to the
I don't agree because I'm not in higher education.
but you are.
Eh,
The
if I
level
was,
of understanding you are at when you got this book, we had already been speaking about it for 3-4 months at least.
oh, true.
If I'd given you this book when we first started, would you have been able to read it through and not just read the words, but actually understand what's being said?
Well, no. Damn, yeah.
So I think it's a great book, and that's what Julia and Jeff even say. They directed it at undergraduates. Now, I'm not saying you have to be in university to be at an undergraduate level of education. I'm saying the way at which you think through problems and your problem solving ability through navigating information, the proficiency, your reading proficiency, to use an OECD competency, needs to be at the level of an undergraduate student. So level 6, if you want to take sort of traditional formal education levels, you want to be around there. That could be everyone in the world, but it's
Mm.
not. Most people are far below that with reading proficiency. And when it comes to actually accessing the book, one, it's Routledge, so that's an academic publisher, which means it's not cheap. And two, how many people are actually going to buy a textbook to understand a different approach to psychology? Which to me is why I think something freely available on YouTube is helpful. Which there are videos available on YouTube, but they're either riddled with terminology that goes well beyond many people's understanding, or they're really old lectures. The audio isn't great, the visuals aren't great, and it's a little bit dated with its explanations. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying it could be improved upon. So that's what I'm looking to do, and I think it's got to be a one-stop shop to jump you in because there are lots of videos about
Kind of like your Obsidian videos were.
well, like some of my beginner's guide to Obsidian, like
Mm.
here is just a chapter-filled video block of stuff. Go
Yeah.
there.
To just going from it from a big massive block and then almost with the other you would have to create more videos.
Mm.
I would say.
But
So
it
you
would
would
be embedded within the
yeah.
other videos.
Mm.
So it's almost like here is the holy grail, one-stop shop, go-to source for all the things.
Yeah.
So when you do explain something, oh, I take the ecological approach and we can constrain this by this and do that by this. If you're confused, go watch this 2-3 hour video essay I did and all these things and jump to the chapter that you want to get an
I
explanation
love how
from.
the fact it went from 1 hour to 3.
I started with 1 hour, but I mean, ecological psychology in 1 hour is still going to be a challenge. I mean,
I
there's
mean,
three.
we barely get through anything in our
I'm
podcast.
going to try and keep it to an hour, but realistically, I reckon it will be longer because I
I think
don't.
it
I
will.
and this is something else that I think we'd need to explore is I don't think it can be entirely abstract. Like,
No.
yes, there would be examples of, oh, I'm looking out in a tree, looking out to different trees and or houses or seagulls or boats on a sea, whatever, and the thing higher up in my field of view is further away because that's the assumption I would make with a 2D retinal image. Right? That explanation is through experience, is through my personal experience as a case study. That's got to be in there. Otherwise, the abstract concepts are going to go well over people's heads. Because when you say, oh, yeah, high up on my field of vision, this is my optic array. What are you talking about? Um, but even once that's been explained and the assumptions have been explored, central executive been challenged, all those sorts of things, when we start looking at ecological haptics and ecological acoustics, how do you actually apply that? Well, now you need dynamical systems. which means
Oh,
so there's going to be a section of assumptions, then another section of ecological terms, but then how do you actually apply that to living organisms? Well, now you suddenly need systems theory and dynamical systems theory, complex theory, and then you go, yeah, but how in the world does all that abstract stuff apply to an educational environment? Well, that's where the introduction to ecological psychology doesn't quite go into as much depth as I would want. Which means, do I
yeah,
bring in some of Rob Gray's books? And I'm like, well, now is it one textbook or is it three textbooks?
yeah. And then once you do that, then the assumptions will be, oh, it's for sports people.
Could be.
Could
That
be.
is where I think. Again, I'm working this out as I go along. I'm writing this script as we're talking about this. So if you have thoughts, let me know in the comments or blah blah blah, internet stuff, Discord. Um, but if we do application to if we do or if I do put an application of the ecological approach towards the end of this video essay, I would want to try and use examples not just in sport. I
Mm,
think repetition without repetition is the Bernstein's principle. I think that could be applied in a school environment,
yeah.
in a physio environment, in other environments, maybe a D&D environment or a learning tech environment. I think I could extrapolate the meanings of the examples to other contexts. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. It's hard, isn't it? Like,
That's why
just,
we're doing an episode on it.
and
And
even
on
that, oh, excuse me, belly scratches.
Yeah, I mean, next week we plan on talking with Scott. If it doesn't happen, then maybe it'll be the week after. But I think it's the same sort of situation there. He asked me perception. Don't know whether we need to follow perception, like direct or indirect perception, because it gets a bit too much in the weeds when it comes to actually like coaching, which I agree with to an extent. But as there always is,
I suppose there's just, well, I'll save it for next week. But yeah.
yeah. But as sort of rounding up a little bit, uh, if even if you don't challenge your assumptions with perception and look at your philosophy of perception and you just coach, you are you
Mm.
are making decisions on what you are doing with the individuals that you are
Yeah.
educating, which has got to be built from a philosophy of practice. And that philosophy of practice will either be from traditional approaches or an ecological approach. It can't not be. And I
Mm.
think because of our bias in current situation in society, it will lean towards the traditional approaches unless you challenge perception. So I think the fact that Scott has challenged perception, traditional approaches to perception, may lead to actions leaning towards the ecological approach. Doesn't necessarily mean it will all be CLA or direct learning, but it's more likely to be easily explained or justified by the ecological approach. That's the way I would see perception. So you don't have to go into Bayesian statistics and free energy principles, but just challenging the traditional approaches, I think, exposes your ability to make those decisions
Yeah.
and potentially gives you the affordance or exposes affordances to do those sorts of things. But yeah, would you watch an hour long video essay about ecological psychology?
Yes. I'm probably not the person to ask the question to.
I'm curious, do you watch video essays on psychology or
Yeah.
you do? Okay. I don't know because I don't know what stuff you watch on YouTube. Obviously, everyone's a bit different.
Yeah.
Cool.
I also like just watching the nature of how people interact with each other. So like one thing right now, the traitors is hilarious
Hmm.
just to watch. So that's one of the things that I've been watching. I've been like, oh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's a series on TV, by the way.
Yeah,
For
there's a series on
those
TV.
listening that are like traitors, what? Huh?
Yeah, the traitors. I think it's BBC. I think
Yeah.
they've actually just started releasing it in the US as well. So there we are.
Hmm. Yes. Okay. Is there anything else you want to add to this conversation? Or?
No, I don't think so.
Right. Well. That's that, and we'll see you all. Well, we won't see you, but we'll talk to you all next week.